close your eyes. Just for a moment. Not because there is anything to fear in the dark, but because what I am about to show you cannot be seen with ordinary light. Take a breath, a slow one. Let it settle in your chest like warm tea, like the particular comfort of a room you have always known. You are safe here. You are always safe here, in this archive. The walls are lined with files, thousands of them, each one a name, a date, a question that history forgot to answer properly. The shelves go further back than the lamplight reaches, and somewhere in that soft, amber-edged darkness, the answers are waiting, quietly, patiently, the way forgotten things tend to wait. This room smells of beeswax and old paper, and something faintly floral, something you cannot quite name. You'll be able to name it by the end of tonight. Outside, beyond these walls, the world is whatever time it happens to be for you. Late, perhaps. The particular kind of late where the house has grown still and the air feels slightly thicker than it did at noon. That is the right kind of late for what I have to share with you. This story was made for exactly this hour. Now, I want you to travel with me. Not far, not to another world, only to another time. The year is 1862. London in 1862 is a city that wears its ambitions like a heavy overcoat, impressive from a distance, but suffocating up close. Stand with me for a moment at the edge of a gaslit street somewhere in North London. Feel the uneven cobblestones beneath your feet, slick with an evening rain that has only just started falling. The air here is something you could almost hold thick with coal smoke from 10,000 chimneys, all exhaling at once into a sky the color of pewter. It smells of wet wool and horse, and the faint sweetness of something burning in a kitchen 3 houses down. The fog is not like fog in stories. It does not drift romantically. It settles. It fills the spaces between lampposts with a yellow-gray murk that makes every gas flame look like a small trapped sun. Footsteps sound different in this fog, muffled, distant, like sounds heard through water. From somewhere inside a nearby townhouse, a grandfather clock is marking the hour. 1, 2, 3. The sound is deep and unhurried, a heartbeat made of brass and oak. It does not care about the fog or the year, or what is about to unfold a few streets away in a house that, from the outside, looks entirely ordinary, entirely safe, entirely like a home. The house at the end of the row had been newly let. The Turners Edmund, his wife Catherine, and their 3 children, Agnes, William, and the youngest, little Mara, not yet 4 years old, had moved in at the first thaw of spring. Edmund Turner was a man of modest but growing success, a wholesale merchant with careful habits and an eye for quality. He had saved deliberately and patiently for a home such as this. 4 stories, bay windows, a small garden at the back where in summer Catherine hoped to grow sweet peas. It was a house that felt like a promise. Catherine had decorated it with the particular joy of a woman who has waited a long time for something lovely. She had chosen everything carefully: the drapes, the carpets, the small framed prints in the hallway, and for the nursery, on the 2nd floor, where the morning light came in clean and generous through east-facing windows. She had chosen the wallpaper herself. It was extraordinary. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise, because even knowing what we know now, even with all the distance of 160 years between that nursery and this archive, the wallpaper was, genuinely, extraordinarily beautiful. It was a deep, luminous green, the color of sunlight through a canopy of summer leaves, the color of still water over moss. The Victorians called it Scheele's green, after the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who had first synthesized the pigment almost a century earlier. It was made in part from copper arsenite. But no one in that nursery knew that yet. The pattern was botanical, twisting vines, full-petaled roses, leaves with such fine detail you might expect to feel their edges if you pressed a finger to the wall. The paper seemed almost to glow in lamplight, the green deepening toward emerald at the edges of each gas flame's reach. Agnes loved it. She was 7, and precise in her enthusiasms, and she told her mother it looked like a secret garden had decided to come indoors. Catherine had kissed her forehead and agreed. The summer passed beautifully. The sweet peas came up in the garden. Edmund's business improved. Mara learned 3 new words, and William, at 9 years old, developed a solemn dedication to collecting beetles in small matchboxes, which Catherine pretended to find less endearing than she did. It was a happy house. Until September. Agnes was the first to fall ill. It began as so many Victorian ailments began, ambiguously, almost apologetically. A lack of appetite, a certain pallor around the eyes. Catherine assumed the change of season. She gave Agnes warm broth and an extra blanket, and sat with her each evening while the lamplight caught the green walls and made the roses seem to lean slightly inward. By the 2nd week, William had the same pallor. By the 3rd, Mara had stopped eating almost entirely. The symptoms gathered slowly, the way a storm gathers, each sign individually explainable, collectively wrong. There was a persistent nausea that no remedy touched. There was a strange metallic taste that children complained of, a sensation like old pennies held too long in the mouth. Agnes developed small sores along her forearms, weeping, slow to heal, resistant to every poultice Catherine applied with such frightened, careful hands. And there was a smell in the nursery. Faint, almost undetectable, but there, on certain evenings when the room had been closed during rain, a smell of garlic. Which was strange, because no one had brought garlic into that room. No one had brought anything into that room but lamplight and love and the most beautiful green wallpaper Catherine Turner had ever seen in her life. The doctor came twice, then a 3rd time. He stood in the nursery with his leather bag and his grave expression, and he looked at the children, and he looked at the walls, and he recorded his observations in a small notebook with the dry rasp of a fountain pen across heavy paper. He had no diagnosis. He had no explanation. He only had, as he told Edmund Turner quietly at the foot of the stairs, a deepening concern. The clock somewhere in the house kept counting, and the green roses on the nursery walls bloomed on, lush and silent and still. Dr. Thomas Orton was not a man given to uncertainty. This is important to understand about him, because it explains the particular quality of his frustration during those autumn weeks of 1862, as he made his careful, regular visits to the Turner household on the hill. He was 51 years old, a physician of considerable experience, trained at Edinburgh, practiced in London for over 2 decades. He had seen scarlet fever and typhoid and the lingering brutalities of consumption. He had sat beside beds he could not cure, and beds he could, and he had learned, across all those years, to read illness the way a sailor reads weather, by instinct, by pattern, by the accumulated weight of 10,000 small observations. He did not recognize what he was reading in the Turner children. He ruled out typhoid first. The symptoms overlapped in places, but the pattern was wrong. Typhoid moved differently, announced itself differently, left different marks. He ruled out scarlet fever within the first week. He considered, then dismissed, a form of slow-acting gaslit poisoning from contaminated water. He tested the water. It was clean. He sat with Edmund Turner in the study on a gray October evening, the fire low, the house quiet in the way that houses with sick children go quiet, not peacefully, but carefully, as though the walls themselves were trying not to disturb something fragile. Edmund Turner's hands, Dr. Orton noted, were clasped very tightly in his lap. "I cannot account for it," Dr. Orton said, and those 5 words spoken by a man who had never said them easily fell into the room like stones into still water. He returned to his own study that night and opened his notebooks. He wrote for a long time. The fire burned down around him, the coal settling and sighing in the grate, his pen moving steadily across page after page in that dry, precise rasp, searching the accumulated library of his own experience for something, any thread that connected nausea, and metallic taste, and slow heaving sores, and the faint smell of garlic in a room where no garlic had ever been brought. He found the thread at nearly 2 a.m. To understand what Dr. Orton found, we must travel back further still. Further even than 1862, further than the Turner children and their luminous green nursery. We must go to a laboratory in Sweden in the year 1775. By the 1850s, Scheele's green was everywhere. It was on the walls of drawing rooms and nurseries and hotel lobbies from Edinburgh to Brighton. It was in the fabric of evening gowns at the finest balls in London, the dancers trailing clouds of fine green dust as they turned beneath the chandeliers, breathing it in with every breath, thinking only of how beautiful they must look. It was in children's books, painted onto the illustrations by hand, in workshops, where young women bent over pages for 10 hours a day, their brushes loaded with the vivid, luminous, copper and arsenic green. The dressmakers who worked the green fabric developed sores on their hands. The flower makers who crafted artificial roses from green-dyed fabric developed persistent lung complaints. The wallpaper hangers, who spent their days pressing seam after seam of the brilliant paper to wall after wall, went home with headaches that never quite left them. And these things were noted, written about. Even there were articles in medical journals raising concern. There was a physician in Germany, a Dr. Ludwig Wolff, who as early as 1839 had written plainly and urgently about the dangers of arsenic-based pigments in domestic spaces. The articles were read. The wallpaper kept selling because the color was so beautiful. Here's where the story takes a turn that even those cautious medical voices had not fully anticipated. Because the arsenic in Scheele's green in its raw, solid form locked into the paper, and the paste was dangerous. Yes, potentially dangerous, under certain conditions. But it was what happened behind the walls that turned dangerous into something quieter, and more patient, and considerably more deadly. Victorian houses breathed damp. This is simply the truth of them. The insulation was poor, the ventilation was poor, the heating was inconsistent. Walls that faced north, rooms that were closed against the cold, spaces behind paper that had been pasted directly onto plaster that never quite dried, these were not merely damp. They were inhabited by fungi, by the particular unremarkable, utterly commonplace family of molds that have always lived in the dark, wet spaces of human habitation, digesting what they find and exhaling what they cannot use. One fungus in particular, Copilariopsis brevicalis, Say that name quietly to yourself, if you like. It is not a dramatic name. It does not sound like a villain. It sounds like something you might find in a dusty botanical index, pressed between pages, forgotten. It is a small, pale, spore-bearing mold, absolutely ordinary, absolutely everywhere. It asks very little of its environment except moisture and something organic to consume. And when Scopulariopsis brevicalis encountered the arsenic compounds in Sheila's green wallpaper paste, it did something that no chemist in 1862 had yet thought to investigate. It metabolized them. It consumed the solid arsenic compounds, processed them through its own quiet biological machinery, and exhaled them as something new. Trinethylarsine, a gas, colorless, nearly odorless, except for one faint, persistent trace note that a sensitive nose might catch on a damp evening in a closed room. The faint, inexplicable smell of garlic. Dr. Wharton set down his pen at 2 in the morning. He looked at what he had written. And then he looked at the word arsenic, and held very still for a long moment, the way a man holds still when he has just understood something he cannot ununderstand. Outside his window, London breathed its coal-smoke breath into the dark. In a nursery 2 miles north, 3 children slept beneath walls the color of deep summer leaves. And the mold in the dark behind the paper went on with its quiet work, exhaling, exhaling, exhaling. Dr. Thomas Orton arrived at the Turner house at 8:30 in the morning. He had not slept. The notebook was in his coat pocket, the pages dense with his small, precise handwriting, and as he stood on the front step, waiting for the door to open, he became aware with a peculiar clinical detachment that his hands were not entirely steady. Edmund Turner answered the door himself. He looked like a man who had also not slept, like a man who had been sitting in a chair since midnight, watching the fire go down and coming to no conclusions. His eyes went to Dr. Orton's face and found something there, some quality of urgency carefully held in check, that made him step back from the door without a word and let the doctor in. "The nursery," Dr. Orton said quietly. "I need to go up to the nursery." The children were sleeping in Catherine's room now, had been for 2 weeks, since the illness worsened. The nursery sat empty in the morning light, its door closed. Dr. Orton stood before it for a moment with his hand on the handle. Then he opened it. The smell reached him before anything else. That faint, almost imagined trace of garlic in the cold air of an unoccupied room. He had smelled it before on his visits, and noted it, and filed it without understanding it. Now he understood it with a clarity that made the back of his neck go cold. He walked to the wall and stood very close to it. The paper was beautiful, even now, even knowing. The green roses curved against their trellis in the gray morning light, the color deep and extraordinary, the craftsmanship genuinely fine. It was the kind of beauty that asked to be trusted. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the surface. The paper was slightly soft to the touch, not wet, not visibly damp, but with that faint give that speaks of moisture behind, of the slow, patient conversation between paste and plaster and the cold air of an English autumn. He pulled his hand back. On the tips of his 2 fingers, visible only because he was looking for it, only because he now knew to look, was a faint trace of powder. The faintest imaginable dusting of green. He stood very still in the empty nursery. The green roses bloomed around him, on all 4 walls, floor to ceiling, hundreds of them, thousands of petals, an entire impossible garden sealed inside this quiet room, and behind every petal, in the dark between the paper and the plaster, invisible, silent, exhaling. He thought of Agnes and her careful enthusiasms. He thought of little Mara, who had stopped eating. He thought of Catherine Turner pressing her palm to this same wall, perhaps on the first day, feeling the satisfaction of a beautiful thing well chosen, of a home taking shape around her family. He thought of how a house is supposed to be the safest thing in the world. He went downstairs and told Edmund Turner to move the family out by the end of the day. He said it quietly, carefully, with the particular gentleness of a man delivering information that cannot be softened, only slowed. The wallpaper came down that same week. Stripped from the walls in long curling sheets of extraordinary green, rolled into bundles and taken away. The roses disappearing one by one from the room where 3 children had grown slowly, mysteriously ill in the most beautiful house their parents had ever called home. The plaster beneath was dark with moisture, and across its surface barely visible, unremarkable, absolutely ordinary, a pale and commonplace mold had made itself a quiet kingdom in the dark. The Turner children recovered. This matters, and I want you to hold it for a moment before we move further. Agnes and William and little Mara, they recovered. Slowly, over the weeks that followed their removal from the house, color came back to their faces, and appetite returned to their meals, and the metallic taste faded from their mouths like a bad dream fading in the warmth of an ordinary morning. They were the fortunate ones, because the Turner household was not an isolated incident. It was, we now understand, simply one of thousands. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, cases of unexplained illness clustered around homes decorated in the fashionable greens. Physicians across Britain recorded symptoms they could not fully explain. A correlation between the wallpaper and the illness was suggested, debated, dismissed, suggested again. The resistance to the conclusion was not purely ignorance. There was money involved. The arsenic pigment industry was vast and profitable. The wallpaper manufacturers issued statements assuring the public of their product's safety. Independent experts were commissioned and found, with convenient regularity, insufficient evidence for concern. It was not until 1879 that William Morris, the great designer, whose own firm had produced arsenic-pigmented wallpapers by the thousands, finally acknowledged the danger publicly. He did not do so gladly. He had spent years dismissing the concern as, in his own words, a scare. The scare, it turned out, had been living behind his wallpaper all along. In 1874, a physician named William Hines produced a book that deserves to be better remembered than it is. He called it Shadows from the Walls of Death. It contained samples, actual samples of arsenic wallpaper, pasted into its pages 46 different patterns, each one a small, beautiful, potentially lethal square of Victorian domestic life. The book was sent to libraries and public institutions across America as a warning. Most libraries stored it in closed collections away from general readers because the samples themselves were considered too dangerous for casual handling. A book that was itself a hazard. A warning that had to be kept at a careful distance. There is something in that, I think, something worth sitting with in the quiet of this hour, about the particular difficulty of warnings that are inconvenient, about how beauty has always been one of the most effective arguments against caution. The green was so lovely. The rooms looked so alive, so garden fresh, so full of a color that the natural world offers freely, but that the decorating world had always struggled to capture. And so the gas exhaled, and the cases accumulated, and the knowing and the not knowing continued their long, uneasy negotiation. As they always have. As perhaps they always will. Arsenic-based pigments were gradually phased out of British wallpaper production through the 1870s and into the 1880s, not through a single dramatic ban, but through the slow accumulation of evidence and the slow erosion of denial, and finally, through the simpler economic logic that the public, once sufficiently alarmed, stopped buying. The invisible became visible, and then, eventually, became unacceptable. The rooms were stripped, the paper came down, and the pale mold behind it, deprived of its arsenic feast, simply returned to being what it had always been. Ordinary, invisible, and entirely, utterly unremarkable. The file on the Turner family is closed now. I am returning it to its shelf. You can hear it, perhaps, if you listen. The soft resistance of paper against paper, the quiet click of the folder finding its place among the others, a small final sound. The rain outside has grown a little louder in the last few minutes. That happens sometimes in this archive, as though the weather listens and responds. The lamp is still burning, and the room is exactly as it was when we began, warm and still and full of the particular safety of a place where difficult things are examined carefully, at a respectful distance, by those who choose to understand rather than to fear. One shadow has been explained tonight, but the archive is vast. The shelves go back further than the light reaches, and there are names in there, dates, places, questions that have been waiting, some of them, for a very long time. Already, on the desk beside this lamp, another ledger lies open. Its pages are cool to the touch, the ink slightly faded at the edges, the way old ink fades, not gone, just quieter. It will keep until you are ready. Rest now. The next entry is just beginning to unfold. Hello, my dear friend. You came back. I had a feeling you would. Settle in, then. The chair is exactly where you left it. The lamp has been burning at the same low angle, casting the same amber warmth across the same shelves, the same rows of files and ledgers and carefully labeled folders that stretch back into the comfortable dark. The room smells of the same beeswax, the same old paper. But tonight, there is something else beneath it, something that crept in through the gap under the door, perhaps, or through a window left open a fraction too long in the afternoon. The smell of rain on warm stone. And something metallic, something that reminds you faintly of the city. That is appropriate, because the case I am opening tonight belongs entirely to the city, to its crowds and its fogs and its magnificent, indifferent machinery of movement. This ledger is older than the last one. The cover is a deep burgundy, worn at the corners to a pale, soft leather. The pages are thick, cream-colored, with that slight resistance that good paper has, the kind that holds ink the way good soil holds water, completely, gratefully. The first entry is dated November 1888. The year matters. Hold it for a moment in your mind, 1888. London in 1888 is a city simultaneously at the peak of its confidence and the edge of its anxiety. The empire stretches across a quarter of the globe, and yet the newspapers are full of shadows. The streets are thick with people, and yet certain corners of the city feel, to those who know how to look, deeply and quietly unsafe. It is a city learning for the first time that crowds are not the same thing as safety. For a moment now, quietly, step outside with me. Not into the archive's comfortable stillness, but out into the street. Feel the difference immediately. The air is cold and wet against your face. Rain coming down in that particular London way, not dramatically, not in great heavy drops, but persistently, as though it has been raining since Tuesday and fully intends to continue through to Saturday without any particular apology. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick and dark, each stone catching what little gaslight reaches it and throwing it back in small, fractured reflections. The gutters run in quick brown rivers toward the drains. And everywhere, the sound. The clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on wet cobblestones. It is not a gentle sound. It is the sound the city makes when it breathes, rhythmic, relentless, slightly percussive, like a vast and complicated engine that has been running so long it no longer requires a hand at the controls. Horses' hooves join it. The hiss of gaslights warming their glass mantles against the rain. The distant call of a newspaper boy whose words dissolve in the wet air before they reach you. And moving through all of it, threading between the carriages and the omnibuses and the pedestrians with their umbrellas tilted against the wind. The hansom cabs. The Victorians call them the gondolas of London, which tells you everything about how they thought of them. There is something aspirational in the comparison. The gondola, that slow and private vessel of Venice, gliding through water streets with its passengers sealed from the world behind a curtain of movement. The hansom cab offered the same fantasy on dry land, or rather, on very wet land in this particular city, in this particular November. The design was elegant in its simplicity. A four-wheeled carriage, high and light, built for speed through narrow streets. The passenger sat inside, enclosed, almost entirely enclosed behind a pair of low folding doors that reached to the chest when seated. Above and behind them, elevated on a platform at the rear, the driver managed the horse and the route and the traffic, communicating with his passenger through a small hatch in the roof. A small square opening just large enough to pass instructions through, and then when the hatch slid shut, the passenger was alone. Entirely, completely, and privately alone, moving through London at a brisk trot, sealed inside their small moving room, invisible to the crowds they pass through. A person could be seen stepping into a hansom cab on one street and simply never arrive anywhere. Elizabeth Parker was 34 years old. She was the wife of Gerald Parker, a successful importer whose offices occupied a handsome building near the Strand. She was, by all the accounts that survive her, a composed and capable woman, not the fragile ornament that the era sometimes made of women of her social position, but someone with opinions and a schedule, and a particular way of moving through the world that suggested she had never wasted very much time. She dressed well without ostentation. She kept appointments punctually. She was known among her circle for a dry, quiet wit that occasionally surprised people who had made assumptions about her based on her appearance. On the afternoon of November the 14th, she had spent approximately 2 hours on Bond Street. Bond Street in 1888 is a street that knows exactly what it is. It is not a street that apologizes for itself. The shop windows are lit with a warmth that seems almost aggressive against the gray afternoon, their displays arranged with the careful artistry of people who understand that desire is largely a matter of presentation. Elizabeth Parker had visited 2 shops. A Glover, the finest in the city, their stock arranged under glass-like exhibits in a small and exquisite museum, and a milliner 3 doors north, where she had collected a hat ordered the previous week. She emerged from the milliner's at approximately 3:30. The rain had intensified since the morning. She stood for a moment on the pavement, the hat box in one gloved hand, a small parcel from the glover's in the other, and looked up and down the street with the calm assessment of someone deciding, practically, on the most efficient route home. A hansom cab was waiting at the curb. Not unusual. Bond Street in the afternoon is well supplied with hansom cabs, their drivers hunched under capes on their elevated platforms, patient as herons in the rain. She said something to the driver. The accounts differ slightly on the exact words. The driver would later recall them as a street name and a house number in Kensington. But the meaning was clear and ordinary. "Take me home." The driver climbed down briefly to open the low folding doors. She stepped inside. The doors clicked shut in front of her with that particular sound, a soft, definitive closure, like a book being gently closed. The driver regained his seat, gathered the reins, and the horse moved off into the gray afternoon, threading into the traffic on Bond Street with the practiced ease of an animal that has done this 10,000 times. The journey to Kensington should have taken, in those conditions, perhaps 25 minutes. The driver navigated competently. He moved through the familiar grid of streets, the horse finding its rhythm on the wet stones, the cab rocking gently on its 2 wheels in that motion that passengers often describe as almost soporific, almost like being carried. He was aware, as drivers always were, of the small sounds from the cab below and behind him, the shift of weight as a passenger adjusted their position, the occasional sound of movement. After a while he was aware of nothing, which was not in itself unusual. Passengers grew quiet. Passengers dozed. Passengers stared out through the gap in the doors at the city sliding past, and thought private thoughts that were none of the driver's business. He arrived in Kensington at 4:15. He pulled the horse to a stop before the address he had been given. A respectable terrace, its steps clean, its brass knocker polished to a shine that the rain was doing its best to soften. He slid back the hatch in the roof of the cab. He called down. Received no answer. Called again, louder. Still nothing. He climbed down from his platform with the slight awkwardness of a large man descending a narrow ladder, walked around to the front of the cab, reached for the handles of the low folding doors, and opened them. The cab was empty. The velvet seat, deep red, slightly worn at the center, the way working cab seats always were, was empty. No passenger, no hat box, no parcel from the Glovers. No sign of struggle, no mark of violence, no broken hinge, no forced latch, no indication that anything had happened inside that small moving room that was in any way out of the ordinary. Only one thing. Resting on the near edge of the velvet seat, placed it seemed with a certain deliberateness, as though it had been set down rather than dropped. A single silk glove. The left hand. Pale gray, the color of the afternoon sky, its stitching fine, its shape still holding, faintly, the impression of the hand that had worn it. The driver stood in the rain and looked at it for a long moment. And then he looked up at the house. And then he looked back at the empty cab. And he did the only sensible thing available to a man in his position. He called for a constable. The small crowd that gathered on the pavement in the rain looked at the open doors of the empty cab with the particular expression that London crowds reserve for things they cannot immediately explain. Curious, unsettled, already, in some instinctive way, understanding that what they were looking at was not merely strange, it was wrong. Inspector Harold Marsh arrived at the scene at 20 minutes past 5. He was not a man who hurried, not because he lacked urgency, but because he had learned across 17 years with the Metropolitan Police that hurrying was almost always the enemy of seeing. A man who rushed toward a scene disturbed it before he understood it. He had watched younger detectives do this dozens of times, arriving breathless, hands already reaching, eyes already cataloging before the mind had properly settled, and he had watched them miss things accordingly. Marsh walked. He walked from his cab to the Kensington Terrace at a pace that the constable on duty later described, with some puzzlement, as almost leisurely. He stood on the pavement and looked at the hansom cab before he touched it. He looked at the horse, still in its traces, patient and indifferent in the rain. He looked at the driver, a large man named Albert Doone, who stood with his cap in his hands in the particular posture of someone who has done nothing wrong and is acutely aware that this may not be immediately obvious. He looked at the small crowd, still gathered at a respectful distance, still wearing that expression of unsettled curiosity. Then he looked at the open doors of the cab. He examined it for a long time. The velvet seat first, running one careful finger along its surface without disturbing the glove, reading the fabric, the way a man reads a page, slowly, completely, from left margin to right. The seat told him very little. No tear in the velvet, no stain of any kind, no mark that suggested force or struggle or any event more dramatic than a passenger sitting down and then apparently ceasing to exist. The floor of the cab next, a thin layer of the city's general grime undisturbed, no scuff of heels, no impression of movement, nothing dropped, nothing left behind except the glove. He lifted it finally with a handkerchief between his fingers and held it up to the gray remaining light. Pale gray silk, 7-button length, the kind sold by perhaps a dozen establishments in London, all of them in the vicinity of Bond Street. The stitching was exceptional. The interior was faintly scented, a delicate dry perfume, something floral, something expensive still present despite the cold air of the cab. It had been worn recently. The silk held its shape with the precision of a glove that knew its hand. He set it down with the same care he had lifted it, and straightened, and stood for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the space where Elizabeth Parker was not. The cab itself, he understood immediately, was the central problem. Not merely as a crime scene, if it was a crime scene, a determination he was careful not to make prematurely, but as a physical object, as a mechanism, because the mechanics of the hansom cab created a problem so specific, so geometrically precise, that it had kept him quiet and thinking during the entire journey from Scotland Yard. Consider the design again for a moment. The driver, Albert Doone, 17 stone, large hands, 17 years on the London streets, sat at the rear of the vehicle, elevated on his platform, a full head above the roof of the passenger compartment below him. He faced forward, as the horse faced forward, as the cab moved forward. His view was of the street ahead, the horse's ears, the traffic to either side. He could not see inside the cab. This is not incidental. This is structural. The hansom cab was designed, quite deliberately, to give its passengers privacy. The low folding doors at the front enclosed the passenger from below. The body of the cab enclosed them from the sides and rear. Above, the roof was solid. The only connection between driver and passenger was the small hatch. A sliding panel, perhaps 8 inches square, set into the roof of the cab directly above the passenger's head. The driver could slide it open and speak down through it. The passenger could call up through it, but it was a hatch for voices, Not for eyes. The angle made it impossible for the driver to see more than a small circle of the seat directly below. When the hatch was closed, the passenger was as private as if they sat in a sealed room. Marsh had asked Dune, carefully and more than once, whether he had opened the hatch during the journey. Dune said he had not. The lady had given him the address clearly before departure. There had been no need for further communication. He had heard, he said, the small sounds of a passenger settling the shift of weight, the adjustment of position in the first minutes of the journey. After that, nothing. Which was, Dune said, not unusual. Which was, Marsh noted privately, entirely true and entirely useless. He turned his attention to the doors. The folding doors of a hansom cab latched from the inside. A simple mechanism, a small iron bar that dropped into a bracket when the doors were pulled closed but effective. The passenger, once enclosed, could release them from inside by lifting the bar. The driver could open them from outside only by reaching over the top of the doors to the same mechanism. The doors had been latched when Dune arrived in Kensington. He was certain of this. He had reached over the top of the doors to open them as he always did, because there had been no response from within to release them from inside. Marsh stood in the rain and considered the locked doors of an empty cab. A woman seen entering, a woman not seen leaving, a locked compartment, now empty, that had been observed by Dune above, by the traffic and pedestrians around it for the entire duration of a 25-minute journey through crowded streets. And here, the Victorian social code inserted itself into the puzzle with all the weight of a structural wall. Elizabeth Parker was a woman of considerable social standing. This is not a trivial detail. In 1888, a woman of her position, her dress, her visible respectability, could not move through London unseen. She was, by the very nature of her class and presentation, conspicuous in all the right ways. Her clothing alone, the quality of the fabric, the cut of the coat, the hat collected that very afternoon from the milliner on Bond Street, marked her as someone who belonged to a specific and visible stratum of the city's life. Such a woman did not simply step out of a moving vehicle. In the middle of a journey through populated streets, in the rain, without a word to the driver above, without being seen by any of the dozens of pedestrians, shopkeepers, crossing sweepers, and omnibus passengers who occupied those same streets at that same hour. The logistics were, frankly, impossible. And yet, Marsh spent the following 2 days doing what detectives do when they have run out of ideas that work. He pursued, exhaustively and without much hope, every idea that probably wouldn't. He interviewed the shopkeepers on Bond Street. The staff at the Glovers remembered Elizabeth Parker clearly. She had been a regular customer. Her account was in good standing. She had seemed entirely well, and entirely herself. The milliner confirmed the hat, confirmed the hat box, confirmed that she had left the shop at approximately 3:30, turning south on Bond Street in the direction of the cab rank. He interviewed the crossing sweepers. These were the boys who haunted the intersections of better streets, clearing paths through the mud and horse traffic for pedestrians willing to spare a penny. Boys of 8 and 10 and 12 who spent their days at ankle height, invisible to the city above them, watching everything. 3 of them confirmed seeing a woman matching Elizabeth Parker's description enter a hansom cab outside the milliner's. One of them, a boy of perhaps 10 with a gap between his front teeth and an exceptionally detailed memory, described the hat box, the gray gloves, the particular shade of her coat collar. None of them saw her leave the cab. Not at any point, not at any junction, not at any pause in traffic, not at any moment during the journey that anyone could account for or confirm. She had been seen with great clarity by multiple witnesses, stepping into the cab, closing the doors, and then, as far as the City of London was concerned, simply ceasing. The rain continued. It had been raining, Marsh reflected, since she disappeared, as though the city itself were engaged in some slow, automatic act of erasure, washing the cobblestones clean of any impression she might have left, filling the spaces between buildings with a gray, indifferent murk that swallowed detail and distance equally. He stood outside the house in Kensington, the house whose address she had given, whose brass knocker she had never reached, and looked at the wet, empty street. And for the first time in 17 years of detective work, he had genuinely no idea where to look next. The breakthrough, when it came, did not arrive dramatically. It did not arrive at Scotland Yard, and it did not arrive on the desk of Inspector Marsh, and it did not arrive through any of the official channels that the Metropolitan Police had been carefully and fruitlessly working since November the 14th. It arrived in a letter, posted from Southampton 3 days before Christmas, in an envelope addressed not to the police, but to Gerald Parker, Elizabeth's husband, in a handwriting that he recognized immediately, because he had been looking at it on correspondence and household accounts and small personal notes left on the breakfast table for 11 years. His wife's handwriting. The letter was brief. It offered no dramatic confession, no theatrical explanation. It was written in the same composed, unhurried hand that Elizabeth Parker had apparently brought to everything in her life, practical, clear, without unnecessary ornamentation. She was safe. She was well. There was nothing to be worried about. She was sorry for the distress caused, though the word sorry arrived in the letter with a certain precision that suggested she had chosen it carefully and meant it only within specific limits. She did not intend to return. The mechanism of her disappearance, reconstructed later from this letter and from the patient revisiting of the route by Inspector Marsh, was considerably less supernatural than the gathered evidence had initially suggested, and considerably more premeditated. There is on the route between Bond Street and Kensington a particular passage of geography that in 1888 created a very specific set of conditions. A narrow service alley, barely wider than a cab, that ran between two terraces near the western edge of Hyde Park. It was the kind of alley that the city generated constantly, and unconsciously, the gap between intentions, the space between one plan and the next. It had no formal name on any map Marsh could find. It was used by tradesmen and delivery boys, and by the horses of the wealthier residents as a route to the mews behind their houses. In the afternoon traffic of a wet November, a hansom cab moving west would slow to almost nothing at the mouth of this alley. The traffic backed up behind a coal merchant's wagon that made its regular delivery to the terrace on the north side at approximately 3:30 on weekday afternoons. The cab would be stationary, or near enough, for 2 to 3 minutes. The driver above, facing forward, watching the traffic ahead for signs of movement. The hatch closed, and the low folding doors of the cab facing directly into the alley's mouth. Elizabeth Parker had ridden this route before. She had ridden it many times. In fact, over the years of her marriage, she knew the coal merchant's wagon. She knew the backup it created. She knew, with the precision of someone who had been planning carefully and quietly for a considerable period, exactly how much time 2 to 3 minutes of stationary traffic would give her. She lifted the iron bar from its bracket, pushed the doors open just wide enough. Then she stepped down, not jumped, not scrambled, with the calm efficiency of a woman who had rehearsed this into the alley's shadow, pulled the door shut behind her, heard the bar drop back into its bracket, with a small definitive click of a plan completing itself, and walked away into the gray afternoon. The hat box under one arm, the parcel from the Glovers in her other hand, the single gray glove left behind on the velvet seat with the deliberateness of a woman who understood that leaving nothing at all would have been its own kind of message. She had left the glove intentionally. Marsh was almost certain of this. It was too placed, too precise for an accident. It was a woman saying in the only language available to her in that moment, "I was here. I existed. I made a choice." She walked through the alley and out the other side into a street where no one knew her face or her name or the address in Kensington, where the brass knocker shone in the rain, where women hide. And puff, she was gone into another life. The question that stays with me, the one I keep returning to each time I open this particular ledger, is not how she did it. The how is clever, certainly. The coal merchant's wagon, the traffic, the practiced step down from the cab into the alley shadow. These are the details of a plan made by an intelligent person who had been paying close attention for a long time. But the how is ultimately mechanics. The question that stays is simpler and older and considerably less answerable. The real question is, why? The letter to Gerald Parker offered none of the expected explanations. No accusation, no revelation of cruelty, no dramatic indictment of the life she was leaving. Simply the statement of a woman who had, at some point between the brass knocker and the Bond Street milliner, and the 11 years of correspondence and household accounts, made a quiet and absolute decision. That she was, by all accounts, finished. With what exactly the historical record does not say. What the historical record does offer abundantly, if you know where to look, is context. Because Elizabeth Parker was not, as it turns out, as singular as she first appeared. The 1880s and 1890s produced a quietly remarkable number of deliberate disappearances, men and women of the respectable classes, who one day, with varying degrees of planning, simply elected to stop being who they were. The Victorian city made this possible in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from where we sit. London in 1888 had no centralized photograph registry, no national records of movement, no system by which a woman who chose a new name in Southampton was in any meaningful danger of being connected to the woman who had stepped out of a hansom cab in November. The city was, paradoxically, most anonymous at its most crowded. 4.5 million people moving through the same streets, none of them required to account for themselves to any central authority, none of them obligated to be tomorrow who they had been yesterday. A person could walk into the fog of a London afternoon and simply unbecome. Could shed the address in Kensington and the husband's account books and the glover's appointments and the milliner's hat boxes. With a simplicity no one would imagine, Elizabeth could put down the silk gloves of one life and pick up the plain cotton ones of another. The city asked no questions it was not paid to ask. It simply flowed around the space where a person had been, the way water flows around a stone, and closed over it and moved on. Elizabeth Parker was found eventually by a private investigator hired by Gerald Parker in the spring of 1889. She was living in Bristol under a different name, working as a bookkeeper for a small import firm, a skill she had apparently possessed all along, though nothing in her life as Mrs. Gerald Parker had required her to use it. She returned to London. The historical record goes quiet after that, in the manner of a story whose final chapters were lived rather than archived. Gerald Parker's accounts show no further payments to the private investigator. The house in Kensington was sold in 1891. And Elizabeth Parker, whatever name she was using by then, whatever cotton gloves or silk ones, whatever address she had settled on as the final version of herself, passes out of the archive's reach entirely, into the fog, into the city, into the particular privacy of a life that chose in the end not to be recorded. The rain is heavier now. You can hear it against the archive's windows, not the steady murmur it has been all evening, but something fuller, more insistent, as though the city outside has remembered something urgent. The ledger for Case 2 is closing, its burgundy cover settling shut with a soft resistance of old pages finding their rest. I am returning it to its shelf, beside the green-spined file of the Turners, beside all the others that recede into the comfortable dark. The street mysteries are cold tonight, but the archive is already turning its gaze towards something different, something that lived not in the fog of the city's thoroughfares, but in the chemical darkness of the developing tray, in the silver and shadow of the Victorian darkroom. Because our next entry concerns those who claim they could do something the city's fog could never do, they claim they could photograph the dead. The fog of the street is clearing, but a different kind of mist is rising in the dark room. Our next entry awaits. We have left the street behind. The rain, the cobblestones, the iron-rimmed wheels and the fog and the anonymous crowd, all of it is gone now, and what replaces it is something altogether different, something still. The room we are entering is not large. It occupies the upper floor of a narrow building, the top floor specifically, because the top floor has the skylight, and the skylight has the light, and without the light there is nothing. There is no other kind of photography in 1862 but available light, no electric flash, no artificial substitute that comes close to the particular quality of gray, diffused northern daylight falling through a glass ceiling onto the face of whoever is seated below. The room was cold, not the cold of neglect. The fire has been lit, the coals are doing their work in the small iron grate in the corner, but the cold of a space that contains glass and metal and chemicals that prefer low temperatures. The cold of precision, the cold of a room that has decided that comfort is secondary to function, and that function here is the capture of light. Notice the curtains first. They are heavy, extraordinarily heavy for a room whose purpose is illumination. Deep burgundy velvet, floor to ceiling on 3 of the 4 walls, capable of being drawn completely closed to transform the studio from a place of portraiture into a place of development. In their open position they hang with a particular stillness of something that absorbs rather than reflects, swallowing the room's sparse light and giving nothing back. They smell of chemical residue and dust, and the faint, Swedish ghost of 100 previous sittings. The chair at the center of the room is not comfortable. It was not designed to be. It was designed to hold a human body perfectly and precisely still for an exposure that may last, depending on the light, the lens, the chemical preparation of the plate, anywhere from 15 seconds to 3 full minutes. 3 minutes. Sit very still, wherever you are, and count 3 minutes in silence. Feel what that asks of a human body, the particular tyranny of perfect stillness, the way the muscles begin, almost immediately, to negotiate, the way the eyes want to move, the hands want to shift, the lungs want to take a breath deep enough to be visible. The photographer's assistant stands slightly to the left of the chair with a device that looks like a medieval instrument of mild torture, a head brace, iron and leather, designed to cradle the sitter's skull from behind and hold it immobile for the duration of the exposure. Most sitters submitted to it with the quiet resignation of people who understood that beauty, in this era, required a certain amount of cooperative suffering. And the glass plates. The photographer lifts one from its chemical bath with tongs, carefully, always carefully, and the smell that rises with it is the smell of this entire world, sharp, metallic, with a particular top note of iodine that seems to coat the back of the throat as much as the nose. Silver nitrate and collodion and potassium iodide combined in proportions that took years to learn and a steady hand to execute. The plate is cold to the near proximity of the hand, cool and smooth and perfectly, dangerously light-sensitive. It must be used within minutes of preparation. Whatever it captures, it will capture permanently. Whatever light falls on its surface in the next 3 minutes will be fixed there, chemically beyond revision. This is the room where our third case begins. Not in the fog, not in the nursery. Here, in this cold and chemical silence, behind velvet curtains that remember 100 faces. Here, where the dead began to appear. Her name, for the purposes of this archive, is Mrs. Adelaide Holt. The historical record preserves dozens like her, perhaps hundreds, and so while Adelaide is a composite, she is not a fiction. She is assembled from letters and newspaper accounts, and the testimony of people who sat where she sat, and felt what she felt, and walked away from the studio on that particular afternoon, carrying something they had not expected to carry. She was 41 years old, a widow of 14 months. Her husband, a merchant of comfortable means, had died of a fever in the summer of 1863, quickly, terribly, without sufficient warning or farewell. She had been managing in the way that certain women of that era managed, quietly, precisely, with an outward composure that those who knew her well understood it was held in place by an act of continuous and exhausting will. She had heard about William Mumler the way most people heard about him in those years. Through a friend, who had heard through another friend, who had read something in a periodical that she had since misplaced but remembered clearly. The details passed from mouth to ear in the particular register of things that are too extraordinary to repeat loudly. Mumler, the story went, was a jewelry engraver by trade and an amateur photographer by inclination, who had, in 1861, developed a self-portrait and found, standing beside his own image on the plate, the transparent, unmistakable figure of a young woman who had been dead for 12 years. He had not recognized her immediately. He had looked at the plate for a long time in the red-tinged silence of his darkroom, the developer still dripping from its surface, and then he had recognized her. It was his cousin. She passed away when she was 19 years old. Adelaide Holt climbed the narrow stairs to Mumler's studio on a Tuesday morning in November. She had told no one she was coming. This was important to her, the privacy of it, the freedom from the particular kindness of people who would have opinions about what she was doing and would express them with the best possible intentions. She sat in the chair. She submitted to the head brace with a composure that the assistant later described in a letter as almost preternatural. She was asked to think of nothing in particular, to simply be still, to let her mind rest in whatever space it found most natural to inhabit. She thought of her husband's hands. This was often where her mind went, in quiet moments. Not his face, which she sometimes struggled to hold with precision, but his hands, which she remembered with an exactness that seemed almost compensatory. The particular way he held a pen, the weight of his palm on her shoulder on an ordinary evening. The camera watched her from its wooden housing with its single glass eye. The shutter opened. The room was perfectly, utterly silent, except for the faint tick of a clock on the mantelpiece above the grate, each second marking itself with the patience of something that has no stake in the outcome. 15 seconds. 30. The gas lamp hisses very softly in its bracket on the wall. 1 minute. The assistant watches the clock with the professional attention of someone who has learned that the precise moment of closure matters as much as anything else in this process. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. Adelaide Holt does not move. The head brace holds her skull with its cold iron certainty. Her eyes are directed slightly past the camera, as instructed. At the middle distance, at nothing in particular, at the air of an ordinary Tuesday morning. And then, the shutter finally closes. The plate is carried quickly, carefully, in the tongs, through the velvet curtain, and into the darkness beyond. The darkness of the developing room is not true darkness, it is red. A single lamp burns there behind a pane of deep ruby glass, casting everything in that particular crimson half-light that registers on the human eye, but not on the sensitized silver of the photographic plate. It is a suffocating color, that red, close and warm and somehow pressurized, as though the air itself has thickened. The plate slides into the developing tray with a soft, liquid sound, a gentle slosh of chemistry against glass. And then stillness. And then waiting. The image comes slowly. This is how it always comes. Not all at once, not as a sudden revelation, but gradually, the way a face rises through deep water toward the surface. The lightest tones first, the broad shapes establishing themselves before the details follow. Adelaide Holt's face appears in the developer. Her composed expression, her dark dress, the slight tension at the corners of her eyes that the camera has caught and preserved with its characteristic, pitiless honesty. The photographer leans closer to the tray. And then he is very still. Behind her left shoulder. Beginning at the very edge of the plate, and extending inward toward the center, with the soft, luminous imprecision of something seen through gauze. A figure. Not solid, not sharp, but unmistakably present. The suggestion of a face, a collar, a hand resting, almost resting on the back of the chair, where Adelaide Holt's shoulder meets the air. The developer continues its quiet work. The figure does not sharpen. It remains exactly what it appeared to be in the first moment of its emergence, translucent, hovering, present in the way that a reflection is present, or a memory. There, and not there. Both, at once. The photographer straightens slowly. He looks at what the plate has given him for a long moment, in the red and pressurized silence of the developing room. And then he carries the plate back through the velvet curtain, to where Adelaide Holt is still seated in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, waiting to be told she may move. Before we follow the plate back through the curtain, before we watch Adelaide Holt's face as she sees what the camera has preserved, I want to step back with you for a moment, not far, just far enough to understand the world that received these images, the world that made them not merely possible, but perhaps inevitable. The year is still 1862. And America is a nation in the specific dreadful condition of a country that has been losing its young men in extraordinary numbers for over a year. The Civil War had been taking lives since April of 1861. By the time William Mumler developed that first curious self-portrait, the casualty lists in the newspapers were already running to columns, names compressed into small print, as though the compression might make the numbers more manageable. It did not. Mothers, wives, sisters, fathers, entire families were navigating a grief that had no ceremony to contain it, no body to bury in many cases, no final moment, no farewell, no last words, only the absence, arriving in an envelope, described in the impersonal language of official correspondence. Into this particular darkness the spiritualist movement had been expanding quietly and persistently for over a decade. It had begun, as so many American movements begin, with something small and domestic and slightly absurd. In 1848, in a farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, two sisters named Margaret and Kate Fox reported hearing unexplained knocking sounds in the walls of their home. They developed a system of communication with whatever was producing the knocks. One knock for yes, two for no. They demonstrated it to their neighbors, and then to wider audiences, and so on, until the word spread fast. The Fox sisters became famous. Their fame produced imitators, and believers, and investigators, and debunkers in roughly equal measure. Seances spread through the drawing rooms of the American middle and upper classes with the speed of a fashion. Mediums offered their services in every major city. The spirits of the deceased, it was claimed, could be contacted, communicated with, sometimes even seen. Most of this, viewed from the comfortable distance of 160 years, is explicable as a combination of grief and suggestion and the very human need to believe that the people we love have not simply ceased. But we need to consider one thing. If we take it into perspective, viewed from inside 1862, from inside the specific texture of that specific grief, the war, the absence, the columns of compressed names in the morning paper, it looks considerably less absurd. It looks, in fact, like the only available answer to a question that conventional religion and conventional medicine had both declined to answer adequately. And that question is, evidently, where did they go? Into this world, William Mumler introduced his photographs, and the world received them with a particular hunger of people who have been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this. Now, here is where I must ask you to hold two things simultaneously. The way this archive always asks you to hold two things. Because the explanation for spirit photography, the technical explanation, the one that satisfies the rational mind and closes the file, is not difficult to find. It is called a double exposure. A photographic plate in 1862 was supposed to be used once and then discarded. Or at least that was what it should be done. The collodion wet plate process was expensive and time-consuming, and there is ample evidence, contemporary evidence, like the complaints of working photographers, that plates were sometimes cleaned and reused when resources were limited. A plate imperfectly cleaned retains, on its silver surface, the ghost of its previous exposure. It wasn't a supernatural phenomenon. It was a faint, residual image, not solid, not sharp, softened by the incomplete chemical removal of the original silver deposits, that will reappear when the plate is used again and developed again. It will appear on the finished photograph as a translucent figure, hovering at the edge of the frame or standing behind the new sitter's shoulder, or resting a hand on the back of the chair. Present in the way that a reflection is present, as if they were standing there, and yet there was no one there. The language with which I described the figure behind Adelaide Holt's shoulder, that language was not chosen for atmosphere alone. It was chosen because it is precisely how a double exposure looks. William Mumler, the jewelry engraver turned accidental spirit photographer, was almost certainly producing his results through exactly this mechanism. Whether knowingly or not is a question the historical record has never definitively resolved. The charitable interpretation, and there are serious historians who hold it, is that Mumler genuinely did not understand what he was seeing on his early plates. That a man without formal photographic training, encountering the phenomenon of residual exposure for the first time, might reasonably interpret it as something other than chemistry. The less charitable interpretation is that Mumler understood precisely what he was seeing, recognized its commercial value with considerable speed, and proceeded accordingly. What the record does establish clearly is that by 1863 he had left his jewelry engraving behind entirely, and that by 1868 he had relocated to New York and established a studio that attracted clients from across the country and eventually across the Atlantic. The sittings followed a consistent pattern. The client arrived, usually alone, usually in grief of some kind. Recent bereavement was the common denominator, though Mumler did not advertise for the bereaved specifically. He did not need to. Word traveled through the particular underground of the grieving, the way useful information always travels among people who share a specific and isolated pain. The client sat. The plate was prepared. The exposure was made. And then came the development, and then the figure. What made Mumler's operation remarkable, what elevates it above mere technical trickery, and into the territory this archive is genuinely interested in, was not the photographs themselves. It was the identifications, because the figures that appeared in the spirit photographs were not always unrecognizable. Sometimes with a frequency that cannot be entirely explained by coincidence or wishful thinking, the translucent figure behind the sitter's shoulder was recognized by the sitter as someone specific. A husband, a wife, a child, dead months or years before the sitting. Never known to Mumler, never described to him, never communicated in any way that the investigators who later examined his methods could verify or account for. The skeptical explanations are available, and they are reasonable. Grief is a powerful editor of perception. A translucent, indistinct figure on a photographic plate offers the same kind of ambiguous prompt as a cloud formation or a pattern in fire. The human mind, primed by loss and longing, will find the face it most needs to find. This is not cynicism. It is, in fact, one of the most tender things about us, this capacity to locate the beloved in the indistinct, to reconstruct the lost ones from the approximate. And yet, there was one sitting, documented, testified to, examined by multiple parties, that the skeptical explanation struggles to account for with complete comfort. In 1869, a woman arrived at Mumler's New York studio. She gave her name as Mrs. Tyndall. She wore a heavy veil, as many of his clients did. The veil offered the double protection of grief's privacy and the anonymity that some sitters preferred. Mumler did not know her. His assistant did not know her. She sat. The plate was prepared with the same care applied to every client. The exposure was made. The development proceeded in the red-lit silence of the room behind the curtain, and the figure that appeared beside her on the developed plate was identified not by Mrs. Tyndall, not initially, but by a journalist present at the studio that day, who recognized the face and who later confirmed the identification through other witnesses. The figure standing behind the veiled woman was Abraham Lincoln. He has been dead for 4 years. The woman beneath the veil was Mary Todd Lincoln, the president's widow, who had traveled to the studio in disguise, without announcement, without any communication that could have prepared Mumler for her arrival. The archive does not tell you what to make of this. That has never been our purpose here. We offer the documented detail, the careful reconstruction, the patient examination of what the evidence actually says, and then we leave the conclusion where it belongs, in the quiet of your own consideration, in the space between the rational and the inexplicable, where the most interesting questions have always lived. The gas lamp hisses softly. The red light holds the room in its particular suspension, and the plate, still dripping in the developing tray, has not yet given up everything it knows. William Mumler was arrested in 1869. The charge was fraud. A photographer named Abraham Bogardus, a man of considerable professional reputation and no patience whatsoever for what he considered a desecration of his craft, had been building a case against Mumler for months. He had gathered testimony from former clients who felt deceived. He had consulted with chemists and fellow photographers who confirmed, in technical detail, exactly how the spirit figures were most likely produced. The trial was a sensation. New York in 1869 had developed a considerable appetite for exactly this kind of public spectacle, the collision between belief and evidence, between the consolations of the grieving and the cold efficiency of the rational, and the courtroom was full for the duration. Mumler's defense was straightforward. He could not explain his photographs. He did not claim to understand the mechanism by which the figures appeared. He claimed only that they did appear, that he had not deliberately produced them through any fraudulent method, and that the comfort they had brought to the bereaved was genuine regardless of their origin. It was in its way an honest defense. And it worked. The judge acquitted him. Not because the evidence of fraud was insufficient. Several witnesses testified persuasively to the double exposure mechanism, but because the prosecution could not prove, beyond the necessary threshold, that Mumler himself had knowingly and deliberately deceived his clients. The distinction between a man who understood exactly what he was doing and a man who genuinely did not, that distinction lived in a territory that the law of 1869 found difficult to navigate with confidence. Mumler walked out of the courtroom and back into his life, which was by then considerably diminished. The trial had done what acquittal could not fully undo. His clientele contracted. His reputation in the photographic community did not recover. He died in 1884, in modest circumstances, his name attached permanently to a question that had never been cleanly answered. The spirit photography movement, however, did not die with his reputation. It continued, evolved, found new practitioners and new techniques in Britain and Europe and across America by the 1870s and 1880s. The double exposure had been refined to a considerable art. Figures appeared more clearly, more deliberately placed, more specifically resembling whoever the grieving sitter most wished to see. The fraud, where fraud existed, had become more sophisticated. and the hunger that drove people to the studios had, if anything, intensified. The Civil War's grief had been joined by the ordinary grief of ordinary years. The children lost to diphtheria and scarlet fever, the husbands taken by the diseases that the Victorian city manufactured so efficiently, the mothers gone too soon, the fathers absent, all of them leaving behind the same unbearable question. Is that all there is? I want to return one final time to Adelaide Holt. Still seated in the chair. Still waiting, with her hands folded and her composure intact, for the photographer to come back through the velvet curtain and tell her what the plate has given them. He comes through the curtain carefully. He is holding the developed plate at its edges, tilted slightly toward the room's gray skylight light. His expression, she notices, is not the expression of a man who has found nothing. It is the expression of a man who is deciding, in real time, how to present what he has found. He shows her the plate, and she looks at it for a long time. The figure behind her left shoulder is not sharp. It has none of the solidity of her own image in the foreground, none of the crisp detail that the lens has rendered in her dark dress and her folded hands. It is approximate, suggested, assembled from light and chemistry into something that hovers at the border between presence and absence. She looks at it for a long time, and then she says something that the photographer would later record in his notes, because it struck him as different from the usual responses, different from the tears, and the gasping reactions from her recognition, and the declarations of certainty that his studio had witnessed many times. She says very quietly, "I don't know if that is him, but it is exactly where he would stand." I have thought about that sentence many times in the long hours of this archive. There is something in it that seems to me more honest than either the credulous certainty of those who saw their beloved clearly in the translucent figures, or the dismissive confidence of those who saw only chemistry and opportunism. She did not claim to know, she claimed only to recognize something about the quality of the presence, the placement of it, the particular spot beside her left shoulder where a specific person had habitually stood in 11 years of ordinary life together. The camera had recorded something. What it had recorded, exactly, whether it was the residue of a previous sitting, or the longing of a grieving woman made briefly visible by silver and light, or something that the archive even now does not have a category for, remains precisely as open as it was in that cold studio in 1862. So this is the curious thing. The spirit photographs are still held in various collections, museums and archives in private hands across America and Britain. Some have been definitively explained, the double exposure mechanism confirmed, the previous sitters occasionally even identified from other photographs. Others remain unresolved. Not dramatically unresolved, not in the way of stories that demand a verdict, simply sitting in their archival folders, slightly foxed at the edges, the silver slowly continuing its long chemical conversation with the air. The figures behind the sitter's shoulders, neither sharpening nor fading. Simply present in the way they have always been present, there and not there. One could say both at once. 3 cases now have found their way back to this shelf. The green-spine file of the Turners, the deep burgundy ledger of Elizabeth Parker and her empty cab, and now this one. Gray as silver, gray as the photographic plates it contains, gray as a November morning in a studio where the skylight admits only the most non-committal of lights. I am setting it beside the others now. You can hear it, Perhaps the small resistance of the shelf accepting one more weight, the soft sound of spines finding their neighbors in the dark. The fire is burning low. It has been a long evening in this archive, and the coals have been patient and generous, but they are nearly done now. The glow in the grate softening, from orange to a deep breathing red that reminds me faintly of the developing room we left behind, that crimson half-light where the unresolved things wait to be seen. I am turning the lamp down. Slowly, the room dims by degrees, the shelves receding first, then the desk, then the last visible edges of the files and folders that hold all the other cases, the ones we have not yet opened, the ones that are patient in the way that forgotten things are patient. The room is almost dark now. Only the last of the fire remains, and outside, listen. The rain has come back, softer than it was during Elizabeth Parker's November, less purposeful. The rain of very late at night, or very early in the morning, when the city has finally grown quiet enough for the weather to be heard again. It falls against the window with the lightest possible touch, barely a sound at all, more like the memory of rain than rain itself. The archive will be here when you return. The files will not move. The lamp will relight with the same low warmth. The shelf will hold whatever it holds, in whatever order the years have arranged it, and there will always be another ledger on the desk when you are ready. There is no shortage of the unexplained. There never has been. But for now, the coals are just embers. The rain is just rain. And all three of tonight's shadows have been examined as carefully as we are able and returned to their proper places. Sleep well. The archive will keep,